Imagine trying to save someone's life, chest compressions going strong, adrenaline pumping, only to be yanked away and handcuffed mid-CPR by the very people who should be helping keep the peace. That's exactly what happened to a seasoned paramedic, right in the middle of a medical emergency, when a power-hungry Homeowners Association board stepped in and made a decision that's now haunting them. The paramedic wasn't just doing his job, he was literally fighting to keep a stranger alive on their front lawn. But the HOA didn't like how it looked, claimed he was trespassing, and within minutes, the situation spiraled into something straight out of a courtroom drama. What started as a call for help turned into a nightmare: sirens, flashing lights, and a paramedic being pulled away in cuffs, while the patient's life hung in the balance. And now, the HOA is staring down the barrel of a $10 million lawsuit, and the internet has asterisk opinions asterisk. Was it an abuse of power, a tragic misunderstanding, or something even worse? In today's story from r/EntitledPeople, we're diving into the wild events that led up to this shocking arrest, the fallout that followed, and the voices demanding justice. But the most jaw-dropping part, that comes when we find out who else was involved and what the body cam footage really showed. The whole thing started in a quiet suburban neighborhood where things like loud music or trash cans left out too long usually stir up the most drama. The paramedic, James, had been in the field for over a decade, calm under pressure, respected by his team, and known for going above and beyond. On that day, a 911 call came in about an elderly man who had collapsed in his driveway. James and his partner were the first on scene, and without hesitation, James jumped into action, performing CPR while waiting for backup. But as he was working to keep the man alive, a couple of HOA board members came storming over, yelling about unauthorized access and property rights. James didn't stop, he couldn't. Time was critical. That's when things turned weird. One board member, reportedly a former security officer, started recording on his phone, shouting legal threats and demanding James leave. When James refused, still doing compressions, they called in a complaint to the police. When officers arrived, the situation was chaotic. Instead of clearing the area or helping, they approached James with suspicion. And that's when the unthinkable happened. Witnesses say the HOA members were pushing hard, insisting James was trespassing and aggravating the situation. But what no one knew yet was that a camera across the street had captured everything, and it would change the case completely. As the officers began questioning James, the tension escalated. He was still in the middle of life-saving actions, and the clock was ticking. The elderly man's pulse was weak, and every second mattered. Yet, the HOA members weren't backing down. One of them, a board president named Linda, insisted that James was trespassing on private property, despite the fact that the driveway was part of the emergency scene. She even claimed that the paramedics hadn't asked for permission to use the driveway for medical purposes, as if that could somehow justify standing in the way of saving a life. From the police officer's perspective, the situation was confusing. They had been called to resolve what seemed like a dispute over trespassing, not to mediate a medical emergency. They didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation, and by the time they tried to intervene, James was already in the middle of chest compressions. The situation, instead of being resolved, was spiraling. James kept trying to explain, his voice firm but strained, telling them he couldn't stop. He was saving a life. But Linda and the other HOA members insisted that they weren't going to allow someone to invade their neighborhood without proper permission. In the chaos, the elderly man's pulse began to fade. The moment was turning into a nightmare. Meanwhile, residents from nearby houses had gathered, some recording with their phones. A few bystanders were shouting at the officers to let the paramedic do his job, but the officers, unsure of how to proceed, seemed more focused on trying to figure out who was at fault than what was happening to the patient. That's when the body cam footage came into play. The officers' cameras were rolling, capturing the whole interaction from their point of view. However, the real twist came from a neighbor's camera across the street, which offered a clearer view of the situation. The footage from that camera would become crucial in the legal battle, showing exactly what went down and raising questions about the HOA's actions and the officer's response. As James continued his frantic efforts, the tension in the air became unbearable. The elderly man's condition was deteriorating fast, and every moment felt like an eternity. With the officers still arguing with the HOA members and Linda getting louder, James was beginning to fear the worst. Was this really happening? Was he going to be arrested mid-rescue while someone's life hung in the balance? The chaos was hard to ignore. Some bystanders were pleading for the officers to step aside, telling them that a life was at stake, while others nervously whispered about the growing scene. The whole neighborhood was now watching, their eyes on the front lawn where this intense standoff was unfolding. And yet, in the middle of all the noise, James kept his focus, despite the handcuffs being pulled out and threats being tossed in his direction. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get worse, the elderly man's breathing stopped. A sickening silence fell over the scene. James's heart raced as he desperately tried to keep the rhythm of CPR going, his mind running through every possible scenario, but the pressure was mounting. The officers were still standing there, confused and unsure of what to do next. One of them even seemed to hesitate for a moment, torn between stepping in and continuing to handle the HOA's demands. Linda's voice broke through the tension, demanding that James be removed from the scene. "He's making things worse." "We need to call his supervisor," she shouted, and the officers reluctantly moved forward, their hands closing in on James. That's when a bystander stepped up, showing the officers the footage they had been unaware of. The body cam footage, coupled with the angle from across the street, revealed something that made everyone stop in their tracks. Linda's behavior and the officer's response were caught on camera in real time, painting a completely different story than what had been told. The neighborhood was on edge. Would James be arrested in the middle of this life-or-death struggle? And what would the footage reveal about the HOA's power trip? The world was about to find out. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, a new voice suddenly rang out from the crowd, one that hadn't been noticed before. A woman, her face flushed with urgency, stepped forward and shouted, "Stop. I know this man. He's the one who saved my husband's life last year." Her words cut through the tension like a knife, drawing everyone's attention. The crowd went quiet, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the air itself had frozen. The woman, identified later as a local resident named Carol, began explaining that James had been the paramedic who had saved her husband, who had suffered a heart attack during a neighborhood BBQ. She had been there when James performed life-saving CPR, just like he was doing now. Her words were filled with emotion, and she made it clear that she wouldn't stand by and watch this man be treated like a criminal when he was the very person who had given her family a second chance. Her sudden intervention caught everyone off guard, especially the officers. Some seemed genuinely moved by Carol's words, but Linda, the HOA president, was visibly irritated. She wasn't going to let a small thing like public opinion derail her mission. "This doesn't change anything," she snapped. "We have a right to control what happens on our property." But Carol wasn't finished. She pointed out that the situation wasn't just about the HOA's rules, it was about basic humanity. Her voice wavered with emotion as she said, "What happened to saving lives? What happened to the oath to protect and serve? This man has done nothing but try to help, and you're going to arrest him in front of us all." The officers hesitated. They were now torn between following the HOA's demands and doing the right thing. They had no idea how to handle the growing pressure from the crowd, the public scrutiny, and the undeniable fact that James was in the middle of performing CPR on a man who was slipping away. The stakes were rising, and they didn't know how to de-escalate the situation without making things worse. Just as things seemed on the brink of exploding, the body cam footage from the officers' cameras and the neighbors' phone footage began to circulate online. By now, the entire neighborhood had seen it, and people were talking. And that's when a third unexpected twist hit. An anonymous tip came through to the local news station. It turned out that Linda, the HOA president, had a history of using her position for personal gain, including manipulating HOA rules to her advantage. The public was about to learn something much darker about the person trying to interfere with James's rescue. As the footage went viral, the pressure on the officers to make a decision became overwhelming. The camera angles from the officers' body cams and the neighbor's phone told a clear story, one that painted the HOA president in a completely different light. People on social media were calling for justice, sharing the video and condemning Linda's interference. Local news outlets were now reporting on the incident, with Carol's passionate defense of James gaining attention. It was clear that public opinion was shifting fast. The tension reached a boiling point when the elderly man's pulse flatlined. In that heart-stopping moment, James didn't hesitate. He continued CPR with relentless determination, refusing to give up. A few breaths later, the man gasped. His heart beat weakly, but it was a start. The crowd erupted into mixed cheers and relief, and the officers, finally seeing the situation for what it was, took a step back. In the midst of the chaos, Carol made a final plea to the officers. "Let him finish what he started," she urged. "Don't let this man's legacy be a tale of injustice. You have a chance to make things right." Finally, with the officers' hesitation, Linda's power over the situation started to crumble. One of the officers, his voice quiet but firm, told Linda, "Ma'am, we need to let this paramedic do his job. We'll deal with the HOA rules later." But the real shocker came moments later, when the tip to the news station was confirmed. Linda had been using her position as HOA president to funnel funds into a private account, pocketing fines from residents and manipulating neighborhood contracts for her own gain. A hidden investigation into her finances was about to surface, and it wasn't just the HOA board that would have to answer for this. The climax came when the paramedic, James, was finally given the space he needed to finish the life-saving procedure. The elderly man was rushed to the hospital, alive though in critical condition, and while the immediate danger had passed, the legal battle was just beginning. The fallout from the arrest, the illegal interference from the HOA, and the growing evidence against Linda led to her being placed under investigation for corruption. But the twist didn't stop there. Just as things seemed to calm down, a surprising new detail surfaced. One of the officers involved in the situation had been a neighbor of Linda's, and reports started to emerge about potential connections that suggested the HOA's influence stretched even further than anyone had realized. The mystery of how deep Linda's control ran was still unresolved, and it seemed this story had more layers yet to be uncovered. In the end, the lawsuit wasn't just about the wrongful arrest, it became about much more. The fight for justice had only just begun, and as the legal battles raged on, the question on everyone's mind remained: how far would the HOA's corrupt practices go, and who else was involved? The town was about to find out. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the incident was nothing short of dramatic. The legal battle over the wrongful arrest gained momentum, and the HOA's reputation crumbled as more details about Linda's financial misconduct were revealed. Investigations showed that Linda had been manipulating the HOA's funds for years, and several other board members were implicated in the scheme. What started as a simple case of overreach by an HOA president quickly turned into a full-blown corruption scandal. The community was outraged, but there was also a sense of relief that the truth was finally coming to light. For James, the paramedic, the experience was both devastating and empowering. The trauma of being arrested while trying to save a life lingered, but the support from his colleagues and the public helped him push forward. The lawsuit against the HOA eventually led to a $10 million settlement, and James was hailed as a hero. The elderly man, whose life James had saved, recovered and was later discharged from a hospital, thanking the paramedic for his relentless determination. Carol, who had been the voice of reason during the chaos, became a local advocate for those fighting against HOA overreach, and many residents rallied behind her, demanding reforms. The community, once divided, found unity in their shared experience and the push for accountability. In the end, Justice wasn't just about winning the lawsuit, it was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost.